Hi everyone, welcome back to Isabella's Bedtime. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's relax and jump into tonight's story. Picture a long empty road winding through the hills, where the trees stand tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. Somewhere along that road, hidden in the shadows, is a place called the Hollow Road Motel, a small, forgotten building with a sign that hums faintly, its light barely cutting through the dark. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about Sarah Kane, a woman who took a job there one cold autumn night, not knowing what she was stepping into. She was 38, tired from a life that had worn her down, and all she wanted was a fresh start after losing everything she once had. What if I told you that her first shift wasn't just about answering phones or handing out keys, but about facing something that knew her name, something that had been waiting for her all along? Settle down now, let the world fade away, and come with me into this quiet tale of secrets and whispers, where every corner hides a question, and every step feels like a dream. Sarah's story starts with a fall, a hard one. She used to work at a bank in a busy city, counting money and smiling at customers until she found papers she wasn't meant to see. Proof her bosses were stealing from people's accounts, ruining lives for profit. She told the truth, sent those papers to the news, and thought she'd done the right thing. But the next day, she was out of a job. Her name whispered like a curse in every office she called. Her savings ran dry. Her little house slipped away, and soon she was sleeping in her car with nothing but a bag of clothes and a photo of her old dog, Rusty. One night, scrolling through job ads on her cracked phone, she saw it. Night clerk, Hollow Road Motel, $45 an hour, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., start tonight. It sounded strange, too much money for such a simple job, but Sarah was desperate, so she drove out past the city lights into the hills where the air felt thick and still. The motel wasn't much to look at when she pulled up. Just a single row of rooms with chipped paint and a parking lot covered in fallen leaves. The office door creaked as she stepped inside, the smell of dust and old coffee filling her nose. A woman sat behind the desk, her hair gray and messy, her eyes sharp like she could see right through you. She didn't ask for a resume or even Sarah's last name, just slid a piece of paper across the counter and said, "Read this. Remember it? Don't tell a soul. You start at 11. Sarah took the paper, her fingers brushing the rough edges, and nodded, too tired to argue. The woman stood, grabbed a coat, and left without another word, the door swinging shut behind her. Alone now, Sarah unfolded the note and read the rules, each one stranger than the last, written in a shaky hand that made her skin prickle. She looked at her watch, 10:50 p.m., and felt a knot tighten in her stomach, wondering what kind of place she'd walked into. The rules were simple but heavy, like stones sinking into a dark pond. At 11:30 p.m., turn off the outside light and keep it off until 6:30 a.m., no exceptions. If the wind chimes by the office door ring when there's no wind, don't look outside. Room 12 is always empty. Tell anyone who asks it's being fixed and never open its door, even if you hear crying. At 2 a.m., the radio will turn on by itself. Let it play for 10 minutes, then switch it off. If someone checks in and says their name is guest, give them the key to room 5 and don't ask questions. Anything that falls from the ceiling vent wrap in a towel, and leave it by the back door. And at 5:50 a.m., stand in the bathroom with the lights off for 5 minutes, no matter what knocks. Sarah read them twice, her breath shallow, telling herself it was some kind of joke. But the quiet of the motel felt too real, too alive, and she knew she couldn't turn back. The night began soft and slow, the clock ticking past 11 as Sarah settled into the chair behind the desk. At 11:30, she stepped outside, the air cold against her face, and flipped the switch on the light, watching the parking lot fade into shadow. Back inside, she sat with the rules beside her, tracing the words with her eyes, trying to stay calm. The first hour passed with nothing but the hum of the heater, and she almost laughed at herself for being so nervous. Then, just after 1 a.m., the wind chimes rang, clear and sharp, though the trees outside stood still as stone. Her heart jumped, but she kept her eyes on the desk, counting her breaths until the sound stopped. A little later, a car rolled in, and a man with a tired smile asked for a room. She gave him the key to room 8, her hand steady, and he shuffled off into the dark. For a moment, it felt normal, like any job, and she let herself relax, her eyelids growing heavy in the dim light. But the quiet didn't last. At 2 a.m., the old radio on the shelf crackled to life, filling the room with static and a faint voice singing a song she didn't know. She froze, watching it play for 10 long minutes, the sound weaving into her thoughts like a lullaby. When the time was up, she turned it off, her fingers trembling, and the silence rushed back thicker than before. Then, at 3:15, a man walked in, his coat damp with mist, and muttered, "I'm guest." Sarah's mouth went dry as she handed him the key to room 5, keeping her eyes on the counter, but she caught a glimpse of his hands, pale and wet, like they'd been underwater too long. He left without a sound, and she sat there, her pulse slow and heavy, wondering what was behind those doors. A little later, something thudded from the vent above. A small, round thing rolled onto the floor, glinting in the light. She grabbed a towel, scooped it up without looking too close, and set it by the back door, her skin crawling as she turned away. The deepest part of the night came slow and strange, wrapping around her like a fog. At 4:30, she heard it, soft crying from room 12, the empty room, rising and falling like a child lost in the dark. The rules burned in her mind. Don't open the door. And she pressed her hands to her ears, whispering to herself that it would pass. It did, eventually, leaving her shaky and cold. Then at 5:50 a.m., she stepped into the bathroom, flicked off the light, and stood in the pitch black, the air tight around her. For 4 minutes, it was just her breathing, slow and deep, until a knock came, soft at first, then harder, rattling the door. She bit her lip, counting the seconds, and the sound grew into a scraping like nails on wood. At 5:55, it stopped, and she stepped out, legs weak, into the gray dawn. At 6:30, she turned the light back on, the motel glowing faintly as the woman returned, her eyes sharp again. "You're still here," she said, almost surprised, and Sarah nodded, too tired to speak. Driving home, Sarah felt the night cling to her, a weight she couldn't shake. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't know. "Good start, Sarah. We see you." She stared at it, her hands cold, then deleted it and kept driving, the road stretching out ahead. At home, Rusty's photo sat on the dashboard, his eyes calm and steady, and she touched it gently before closing her eyes. The motel was more than a job. She knew that now, something tied to her, something waiting. But for tonight, the story ends here, soft and quiet, letting you drift into your own dreams. Sleep well, and maybe tomorrow we'll find out what cries in room 12. Imagine the Hollow Road Motel under a sky heavy with clouds, the kind that swallow the stars and leave the world feeling small and closed in. The air is cool tonight, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, and the motel sits there, its single row of rooms like teeth in a sleeping mouth. We're back with Sarah Kane, who survived her first night behind the desk, following rules that whispered of something strange, something watching. What if I told you her second night wasn't just about making it to dawn, but about facing a truth she'd buried long ago, a truth the motel wouldn't let her escape? This is the end of her story, a tale of shadows and answers that creep closer with every tick of the clock. Lie back now, let your breathing slow, and follow me one last time into this quiet place where the past waits patiently and the night promises rest at last. Sarah barely slept that day, her mind replaying the crying from room 12, the wet hands of the man called Guest, and the text that knew her name. She sat in her car outside her rented room, staring at Rusty's photo, his brown eyes steady while hers felt raw and heavy. The rules stuck with her, looping in her thoughts like a song she couldn't shake, and that message, "We see you," sat like a stone in her chest. She didn't want to go back, but the money pulled her. The $45 an hour she needed to keep her car, to eat, to not disappear completely. As the sun sank low, painting the hills gold and gray, she drove out again, the road to the motel feeling shorter this time, like it was pulling her in. She arrived at 10:45 p.m. He office empty, except for a new note on the desk, and the gray-haired woman was gone, leaving only silence and the hum of the heater. Sarah picked up the paper, her hand steady now, ready for whatever came next. The new rule was short, written in the same shaky hand, but it felt heavier than the others. At 3 a.m., go to room 12, knock twice, and wait. When the door opens, step inside, but don't speak. Sarah read it over and over, her breath catching as she thought of the crying she'd heard, the rule that said never to open that door. The clock hit 11 p.m., and she settled in, the night unfolding slow and thick around her. At 11:30, she turned off the outside light, the parking lot fading into a sea of shadows, and sat back down, watching the minutes crawl by. No cars came, no guests knocked, and the quiet pressed against her ears, broken only by the soft creak of the building settling. She kept the rules close, flipping the paper between her fingers, wondering what waited in room 12 and why it felt like it was waiting for her. The hours drifted on, each one a gentle pull deeper into the night. At 2 a.m., the radio crackled on again, playing that same faint song, and Sarah let it hum for 10 minutes before switching it off, her movements slow and careful. The wind chimes stayed silent this time, and nothing fell from the vent, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Then, at 3 a.m., she stood, her legs heavy but sure, and walked to room 12, the key ring jangling softly in her hand. The motel was still, the air cool against her face as she stopped at the door, its paint chipped and gray. She knocked twice, the sound swallowed by the night, and waited, her heart a dull thud in her chest. After a long moment, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to breathe. Sarah stepped inside, her voice locked away as the rule demanded, and the door clicked shut behind her, soft and final. The room wasn't a room. It was something else, something impossible. The walls stretched up and out, far beyond the motel's size, into a space that smelled of metal and dust, lit by a faint blue glow from machines she couldn't name. In the center stood a chair, cold and steel, covered in wires that pulsed like veins, and sitting in it was a figure she knew, herself, younger, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah's breath stopped, her mind spinning as she stared at this other her, strapped down, a shadow of a memory she didn't own. A voice came from nowhere, calm and low, saying, "You found us, Sarah. You can't hide from what you were." She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet stayed rooted, and the room hummed around her, pulling at something deep inside. The figure in the chair looked up, meeting her eyes, and whispered, "They took it from us. Our years, our truth." Then the lights flickered, and the room was just a room again, empty and small, with Sarah standing alone. She stumbled back to the office, her head pounding with flashes, white walls, a man in a coat, needles in her arm, voices saying, "Erase it, start over." The conspiracy she'd uncovered at the bank wasn't just theft. It was bigger, tied to experiments, to people like her who'd seen too much and been made to forget. The motel wasn't random. It was a trap, a test, a place where the past clawed its way back. At 5:50 a.m., she went to the bathroom, turned off the light, and stood in the dark, waiting for the knocks that never came this time. The silence was a gift, letting her breathe, letting her think. When she stepped out at 5:55, the motel felt different, quieter, like it had gotten what it wanted. At 6:30, she turned the light back on, the faint glow spreading across the lot, and a gray-haired woman walked in, her sharp eyes softer now. "You're done," she said, and Sarah nodded, knowing it was true in more ways than one. She drove away as the sun rose, the hills turning pink and gold, and stopped at a gas station miles from the motel. Her phone buzzed one last time. "You remembered, Sarah. Rest now." She deleted it, tossed the phone into her bag, and sat there watching the world wake up. The flashes in her mind settled. Years stolen, memories locked away, a life she'd been forced to lose. But she had it back now, or enough of it, and the weight lifted, leaving her tired but whole. She thought of Rusty, of finding a new place, a new start, and smiled faintly as she drove on. The Hollow Road Motel faded behind her, a shadow in the rear view, its secret spent. And so, her story ends, gentle and complete, leaving you here in the quiet. Close your eyes now, let the night take you, and sleep deep until the next tale calls.